You're listening to a podcast by the Center for Action and Contemplation. To learn more, visit cac.org.
Hi, everyone. It's Brian. One of the assumptions that guide us in making learning how to see is that we really learn best together in conversation, in community, and by asking questions we can't answer alone. I have a favor to ask. If this podcast has been helpful to you, would you consider leaving a rating or review wherever you listen? That small gesture helps other spiritual seekers find their way here, and it helps us grow the community of people learning how to see and learning how to love. And please keep your questions coming. Your questions guide us, and they help us feel connected as fellow learners. You can always reach us at podcasts@cac.org.
Hi, I'm Carmen Acevedo Butcher.
And I'm Brian McLaren, and welcome to Learning How to See.
As the podcast name suggests, this podcast is about seeing. Each season, we explore some aspect of learning to see, learning to encounter reality, not just on the surface with our eyes, but deeply with our whole being.
And this season, we are exploring what it means to see with eyes of love.
Thank you for trusting us with this time and for being the kind of person who cares about learning how to see with eyes of love.
In today's episode, we will be joined by Cindy Lee. Cindy S. Lee is a spiritual director and aspiring mystic and proudly Taiwanese American. She leads retreats in the areas of Christian mysticism and BIPOC-centered spirituality. She completed a PhD in practical theology in the area of spiritual formation from Claremont School of Theology. With Cindy's help, we will be considering the topic, seeing others as witnesses to their growth and struggle.
Then, Brian and I will have a brief conversation about our interview. Then we'll lead you in a guided meditation and conclude with a few minutes of silent contemplation. It's our hope and prayer that after our time together, you'll feel re-centered on what really matters, and that you will open your eyes with a deeper sense of love for all you encounter.
Welcome, everyone, and special welcome to you, Cindy Lee, our guest today. Dr. Cindy Lee, I should say, a graduate of Claremont School of Theology, where I have many good friends, and I was on the board there for many years and have such great respect for that community. Welcome, Cindy. I wonder if you could introduce yourself to folks, let us know what you would like people to know about you.
Well, thank you, Brian and Carmen. It's great to have this conversation with you today. And my name is Cindy Lee. I live in the Los Angeles area. I'm Taiwanese American. I'm a spiritual director, and I spend a lot of my time teaching and training people in spiritual direction and spiritual companioning.
I'm reading your beautiful book, Contemplative Witnessing, BIPOC-Centered Spiritual Direction. And I think all of us who are familiar with what spiritual direction is immediately get it. The idea of being a witness, of being a companion who says, your experience matters, and I want to stand beside you in witnessing or affirming or validating your experience. I'd love to hear more about how you got interested and involved in spiritual direction and why this has been an important theme of your life and work.
Yeah, I actually went into spiritual direction training for myself after completing a PhD degree. And so when I went into it, I wasn't actually planning to practice as a spiritual director. I just saw in it something for my own formation of, how do I form myself to be a listening presence in my community? And so it's just something I wanted for myself. As I entered into that training, however, during that time, it was very difficult to find a person of color spiritual companion. And so I just saw a need that I could help fill. And so I started practicing and only saw people of color as clients or directees. And then that created a shift into my life in which then I was asked, to speak at various schools and training organizations in spiritual companioning to speak on that shift and how we companion communities of color. It was a shift that I didn't expect or plan for my life, but now much of my life is spent in that spiritual companioning space and training others in that.
One of the things you talk about that I think is so important, you talk about how in your training, so many of the assumptions of what spirituality is and spiritual formation, spiritual growth, what they mean, were really shaped by a very Western worldview. I think this is very insightful and important. I wonder if you could unpack that a little bit and talk about that from your own background and your experience helping other people of color.
Yes, I think it just came from my lived experience. And as I was opening my practice to be with people of color, to sit and witness and listen to people of color in different communities of color, I realized my training didn't prepare me for what I was experiencing. What I was listening to, what I was experiencing was just very different. And so that led me to just asking questions and making observations of, okay, what's different here? And then what needs to shift in how we are present to people and how we witness people based on the shift and the differences that I was noticing.
Mm.
One of the things that really got my attention in your book, Contemplative Witnessing, Cindy, and that I so appreciate is you talk about confronting the Western missionary gaze. And, we're talking this time about loving very difficult people in very difficult situations, but what if that difficult person is a collective? And can you tell us a story or something from your experience about that? Because you have a real talent for using language in new, fresh ways that bring us into an awareness of some of the paradigms that we're living in that maybe before we hadn't noticed, like the fish in water, And Western missionary gaze is one of those phrases for me.
Yeah, this was a noticing that came from myself, but also as I was listening to other people of color, is that the Western missionary gaze is something we have embodied, and we see ourselves as Asian American or as a person of color with that gaze on ourselves. There's a particular story that's actually in the book that came from being in a class. The class was called Folk Religions, and it had like qualities, characteristics of a folk religion. And one of the assignments of this class was, okay, go out and observe, make observation notes of folk religious practice. Already that assignment had a Western gaze or centeredness to it. It centered Western religions. So it made Christianity the norm, and anything outside of that norm labeled folk religion. I didn't have the eyes to see that at the time. So I did the assignment. I went out with that Western centeredness and that Christian centeredness embodied in myself. I went to a Taoist temple in Taiwan. I was living in Taiwan at the time. And then I tried to use the parameters of the class to assess this folk religion as something less educated, as something other. But as I was doing this observation, all I saw was how beautiful my people are, how beautiful our practices, that it wasn't uneducated, that it didn't come from these other lenses. And all of a sudden I realized, oh, I have been taught to embody this Western missionary gaze, which refers to that when Western missionaries went out into all these other cultures, they experienced otherness, this otherness. And this otherness was in very tangible ways, right? Other smells, other sights, other ways of moving your body, other sounds. But because it was so different from their own Western-centered experience and cultural experience, they labeled that otherness as evil, sinful, wrong. So then for communities of color that were then influenced or raised in a Christian tradition, we were then taught to see our own cultures and our own bodies with those labels. We are evil and sinful and wrong. That is the Western missionary gaze. We look at ourselves and our own cultures and our own families in that way. And I would hear it all the time as I was sitting with people of color and listening to their stories, that we saw ourselves with hatred and we were taught to see ourselves that way. So then the question is, okay, how do we get that out of our bodies? Like that, how do we uproot that from ourselves and be able to see ourselves in new ways?
Well, can you add just a little coda? Because I just love that story so much, and say what you ended up doing for that assignment?
Well, if it became absorbed in us in very embodied ways, then we need very embodied ways to get that out of us. So that means leaning into our own cultural traditions and spiritual practices and just doing them without that judgmental voice and, that question in our heads of, is this right or wrong? Am I doing this right or wrong? Getting out those critical voices and allowing our body to teach us and to speak to us. And for some people, at first, it will feel very awkward to our bodies, but we just do that, right? Do the bows, the practices, the smells, the foods, the movements, right? Tai Chi movements for me, right? Calligraphy movements for me, and just allow my body to teach me as I'm getting used to these movements that are actually very natural, right, to my own culture and my own spiritual traditions.
That's beautiful.
It strikes me the difficulties we have that make us see some people as difficult often trace to exactly what you're identifying, that people have the experience of their background or an experience that was presented to them as normative, and we accept, oh, that's normal. And anything that's not part of that normal is strange and odd, and it's not right. Why isn't it normal like what I'm used to, right? And so then we think of that other person or that other community as less than, something wrong with them. Boy, this changes the way we see. It really changes the way we see. As you were sharing, I had this memory come back to me. I was on the board of a seminary, a different seminary, and one night we had a little reception for the board members and a bunch of the students, and maybe 40 or 50 people in the room. And they just invited the students to speak up. And one fellow spoke up, and he was a Korean student in the US for his graduate school. One of the faculty members whispered over and leaned in my ear and said, I've never heard him say a word up until this moment. He's been totally quiet. And his English, he was really struggling with his English, and which sort of, I don't know, my feeling was, what an amazing thing that he's managing to survive in graduate school. And he persevered and really expressed himself powerfully. And he said that when he came to seminary, he had this realization. He said, I know more about Plato and Aristotle from my previous seminary training, which happened in Korea. I know more about Plato and Aristotle than I do about Confucius or Lao Tzu. And he said, one night I became curious about my own heritage, and I thought maybe I'm allowed to appreciate my own heritage as a Christian. And he said, I went to the library and I checked out the Tao Te Ching, this precious volume from Taoism. He said, I brought it home and I read it, and I felt guilty as if I were committing a terrible sin. But he said, I was so engrossed that I read through the night. And he said, that was the night I learned to accept myself and my own heritage. And the barriers that we put that alienate us from ourselves and from each other.
Yeah, that's a great story. I mean, there's a sense of coming alive in that story, right? That reading all through the night because something connected, and is even a generational connection, and it makes you come alive when you can access that in yourself.
For you as a spiritual director, if someone came to you and said, there's this difficult person in my life I just can't understand, or we're at constant odds with each other, and they said, could you help me figure out what I need to do about this? I wonder what your instincts as a trained spiritual director would be. And I wonder if there are any stories about some individual who has represented that kind of challenge for you?
Yeah, I think in spiritual direction, we're very annoying in that we don't problem solve. And so, right, as soon as someone brings them something like that, the focus is not on resolving the conflict or resolving the issue. Instead, we enter into an attunement and a listening to what's happening. And there's multiple layers of attunements there, especially if it's a person of color. The first thing we pay attention to is there any harm that you're experiencing from this conflict? How are you absorbing that? Are you experiencing, any grief or just pain, and being able to give space and time for whatever it is they feel? And sometimes that's enough, is just giving attention to that in a conflict of what is their embodied experience, what are they feeling, and acknowledging all of those as important communications, important things for us to listen to, more than just resolving the issue. That whatever they feel, whatever they experience is valid, and we can pay attention to them. And then from there is, especially for people of color, then it is asking questions about their agency, how they care for themselves, how they protect themselves when navigating through these difficult situations. Again, it's not about problem solving, it's about a deeper connection, accessing and attunement to themselves as they navigate through the context they may be in. And it may be a harmful systemic context that they're in. And so, if at this point they have no choice but to be in those sorts of contexts, then I'm constantly turning attention to, okay, how do we care for yourself? Where do you have agency? Where do you have power? Where can you make those decisions? And let's listen to the wisdoms that are within you, and let's access the resources they have, which might be the resources they have within them. It might be their community's resources. It might be generational and ancestral resources that they can connect to.
I'm just thinking for someone who has never really heard of spiritual direction before, that example you just gave helps them see really what's at the heart of it. It's not being a fixer or a problem solver, but it really is being a loving companion or witness to help them take their own experience seriously. And I suppose that when we encounter other people as difficult, that is such a good place for us to start by taking our own difficulty seriously.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I love that, Cindy. And I love, Brian, that you brought that up on top of it, because I appreciate, Cindy, how, because a lot of people say spiritual direction does sound like you're going to direct somebody what to do. And spiritual companion is how some people say it. And you have contemplative witnessing, which I think is beautiful. The gaze of, two people having dialogue together. And I want to say that I really appreciate that Fortress Press has brought out both the contemplative witnessing and our Unforming, de-Westernizing spiritual formation, which I read in 2022 when it first came out. And I heard you say just a minute ago that one of the things you would do with someone who came with that difficulty that Brian posited there is that you would ask them what resources do they have communally and internally. And one thing that really resonated with me in Unforming and also in contemplative witnessing is that you say that the rested self is our truest self. And it seems to me that you keep coming back to rest in very articulate ways. And I just wondered if you could say something about that, because one of the things, I just want to read a quote. You say, rest is a way of being that we can carry even into our work, as it helps us let go of any unhealthy attachments we may have to work. Who we are in our rest determines who we are in the world. If we know our Sabbath identities, we avoid dehumanizing other people for their labor and production. That's from Contemplative Witnessing. I just wondered if you could just speak more about that, because when we read you, we can tell you're someone who works at resting. if I can put it that way.
I do really spend a lot of time resting. It feels counterintuitive. It feels countercultural that when we are in our busiest seasons, our most stressful seasons, we actually need to slow down and do nothing. And that is actually what will resource us to face the things that we are holding and carrying in that season. But our minds will tell us, well, no, I have so much to do. I can't do that. But there's something magical about it that when you choose that slowing down, when you choose that rest, all of those things you have to do, you'll be fine. You'll get it done. I think a part of that is, we live in a global culture of consumerism and greed and productivity. And all of those values dehumanize us. All of those values, when we live into them, we lose access to ourselves. We don't know ourselves anymore. And so, what rest does is just an invitation to, okay, once we stop, once we slow down, we can take a good look at ourselves and get to know ourselves. And when that happens, then we have a center, a core, a foundation in which to go back out into the world and the things that we need to do to survive. But then taking that grounded, centered presence with us as we go.
I'm curious too if you could give us some wisdom on ways that you or advice that you have for when we do encounter very difficult situations ourselves. One of the things, reason I want to ask you this is that you quote Howard Thurman, someone I deeply live with, from Meditations of the Heart. He says, and you quote him, Thurman says, "There is no need to fear evil." And that's counterintuitive, right?
Mm-hmm.
So there is no need to fear evil. There is every need to understand what it does, how it operates in the world, what it draws upon to sustain itself. And then you add, this is the shrewd posture of a contemplative witness. Spirituality without justice is empty. And I wondered if you could speak into that as we're all searching for ways to show up in difficult days.
Yeah, that quote from Howard Thurman is just one that I've just been meditating on all throughout this season, this collective season that we're in, just as one of my practices. And I actually had this experience, a very memorable experience, just a few months ago. So this was back in June when National Guards were sent to Los Angeles to support ICE in their raids, particularly in communities of color. And so I went downtown to downtown Los Angeles during that time. And something about the imagery of what I saw really struck me. The imagery of tanks and lines of people in military uniform and masks and weapons and shields. And something happened within me. It was a very embodied experience in which this generational memory started to surge up from my body. That's the actual movement. It went up from my body. And then I went, aha, my ancestors have experienced this before.
Mm.
And it brought up this generational remembering that my ancestors lived most of their lives under a military presence. So my grandparents and their siblings were born into the Japanese occupation of Taiwan. In their adulthood, the Japanese left, and then the Chinese nationalists came over and took over and ruled Taiwan under martial law for 38 years. And so my grandparents and their siblings lived the majority of their lives with that military presence surrounding them, surrounded by soldiers and tanks and people in masks with weapons. And so then that generational memory brought up these new questions in me of how did they live through the turbulent and violent times in which they lived? And then what do they have to teach me to teach us in how do we live in the turbulent and violent times in which we lived? Something that I remembered then as I was asking that question was, well, they kept their kindness despite it all. They kept sharing with community and supporting each other in very practical ways. Like if you were a doctor, then after hours, you saw the families that didn't have medical insurance or couldn't afford to go to the hospital. If you cooked, then you cooked for the community. If you were an accountant, then you helped people with taxes who had difficulty with understanding taxes. And you just use whatever practical skills you have to support your community. And when we're surrounded by people that it seems that they embody hate and violence, and it's not that we condone that hate, but we can't, as Thurman said, we cannot absorb that hate and we cannot become that hate ourselves. And so we have to lean into these ancestral resources we have of living with a fierce love and a fierce kindness and a fierce community for our survival. And that's one way of actually confronting that embodied violence and greed and hate that we see in people. It doesn't always mean a direct confrontation. It also means being the kind of community we hope to be and hope to see, and then being able to invite others into another way of being, another way of living in this life and living in community. That's another way of then balancing, right? Bring harmony back into this distorted community and reality that we live into.
Thank you, Cindy. That's beautiful.
Yeah, Cindy, I was just thinking as you were just speaking, if I were a listener to this podcast, I would hit replay about 4 times just to
Yes.
hear what you just said, because I think we all realize that these situations are not just theoretical, that some of the most difficult circumstances we face are related to political things going on in our country and world at this moment. One of the things that I felt as you were speaking is the response to these difficulties. It's not just an individual response. One of the things we have to do is find our people, find our community where we can go for collaboration and mutual support. This is one of the characteristics, I think, of what's gotten us into trouble. We've thought of ourselves as individuals disconnected from each other. And maybe the only way to something better is to begin now by finding our people in that way. It seems to me, as a spiritual director and companion, in some ways, probably people reach out to you often when they don't feel they have anyone to go to. You become a kind of portal into a kind of community and sharing. And I wonder if we might end this time with you just reflecting on what it is like to be a loving witness to people, not a witness in the sense of telling people what they should or should not do, not trying to fix them, but observing and taking seriously their experience. Could you just share with us, maybe in closing, a little bit about what that feels like for you, and what do you think that experience means to the people who come to you?
Yeah, I do want to recognize how difficult that may be especially when people are feeling really lonely themselves and they really need other people to show up for them. However, those of us who feel like we do have some capacity, we need to start showing up for the people around us with noticing whatever capacity in which we have to do that. And so to be that person who reaches out to others, who responds with communal support in whatever ways that we can. And, those are really small things. Those are very little things in which you text a friend because you just thought about them. Or when someone expresses a need, how do I show up for that need? When someone is grieving, okay, how do I be present to that? And so it's just very small actions and decisions that we're making every day, but to make the choice to show up. I will show up for my community. And then how that looks like tangibly will make itself known as it comes up.
I just want to say I'm so glad you asked that, Brian, because one of the things I loved that you wrote, Cindy, is instead of asking ourselves, how do I help? We might ask ourselves, how might I offer a healing and restful presence? like sending a text, and many other ways. That's a very good reminder. Thank you.
Yeah. And I think the difficult part about that then is that means I have to be really attentive to myself and caring for myself every day so that I can show up for my community with that sort of presence that I hope to be in community.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. You've given so much for Carmen and me as your conversation partners, but I know for listeners too, so much that will help us in these difficult times. Sometimes we're probably prone to label people as difficult people. And one of the takeaways for me from this time together is, well, maybe, yeah, we can be difficult people, I suppose, but maybe we are having to wake up to the fact that we're in difficult times and we're in difficult systems. And that requires us giving grace to other people, but also grace to ourselves.
And also that we have always been in difficult times and difficult seasons, and some people are realizing it now for the first time, but they have always been there. And so perhaps every generation then gets that choice. How will we be a presence of healing and change and love in the systems that we've been given?
Thank you, Cindy, for sharing your wisdom with us. So beautiful and meaningful and practical.
Thank you both. I enjoyed this conversation with you.
Learning How to See will be back in a moment. Carmen, I was thinking about our conversation with Cindy and how her training as a spiritual director really comes through in the way she answered our questions. And you could just tell in the way she thinks. She has been trained to see people not as a director, like that word spiritual director might say, where she's going to give people directions and tell them what to do, but as a witness, as she used that word many times. And of course, it's in the title of her book. I could just imagine sitting in her presence as a spiritual director. And what I would feel from her is that she would be looking at me with eyes of love, and she would be looking at me to invite me to be honest with myself and to be honest about where I see God or the Spirit at work in my life. And she would be a witness to that and affirm that. And she would do it in an understanding rather than judgmental way, always eliciting more from me rather than trying to in any way shut me down and tell me what to do. I just feel so many people, that's what we need, isn't it? We need a person who will be that kind of witness to our own struggles, our own growth.
That's so well said, Brian, because that's one thing that happened to me when I was listening to her. I thought, wow, I would enjoy spiritual direction or contemplative witnessing with Cindy, because she didn't give us the feel at all that she saw herself as above, as spiritual direction might sound, but as someone alongside and accompanying, those who come to her. And that, to me, that interconnectedness seems so super important. And I love the fact that she loves Howard Thurman, the Reverend Dr. Howard Thurman, and how she really seems dedicated, Cindy does, to helping people listen to the sound of the genuine in their own selves. And how she also talked about that in accompanying people in this way, she also realizes new things about herself. And so that it's really friendship more than it is a hierarchy at all.
In fact, that's one of the old names for spiritual direction before it was called spiritual direction. In the Celtic world, it was called anam cara, which meant a soul friend, someone who is that kind of a presence to you. And there was a sense of a peer relationship of mutuality. Carmen, I'm just thinking when you referred to Howard Thurman and that amazing, it really comes across as poetry, even though it was part of a commencement address that he gave. But that message, the sound of the genuine, I think we will be sure to put a link to that in the show notes so people who've never encountered it can encounter it. This idea that within us there is something beautiful and good and true and genuine that wants to be seen and acknowledged and wants to express itself and make contact with the genuine in another person. I suppose that's really a part of what you and I are hoping for in this season of Learning How to See, that people will feel empowered and given permission to be that kind of presence to each other, that kind of anamkara or soul friend, because we're all so used to people looking at us and listening to us to find fault or to find some place where we disagree so they can correct us. And what we really are longing for is someone to look in us for what's good and beautiful and genuine.
I love that. And it does seem to be what Jesus wants too, because he's always telling the disciples, I'm not your teacher, I'm your friend. I mean, so if Jesus says it, who am I to argue? This sounds like a good approach. And it also does help us not fall into that trap also of trying to find somebody to look up to and to give our agency over to. So I'm for this. If we could emphasize friendships more, and that's what Cindy did, was really to keep us in that sphere of peer to peer. And I really appreciated that.
Many people who are not familiar with the Bible have heard this chapter that we're making the focus of our sacred reading or Lectio Divina practice this season. 1 Corinthians 13, they've heard at weddings perhaps, because it's a chapter that just feels like gorgeous poetry and deep and rich in meaning. Each episode this season, we're looking at this whole chapter, and then we're taking a deeper dive into one section of the chapter. And so we begin by giving you the chance to listen deeply and attentively to the passage read as a whole. This is a reading of 1 Corinthians chapter 13, a translation by Carmen Acevedo-Butcher.
If I speak with the tongues of humans and of angels, but do not have love, I am an echoing gong or a ringing cymbal. If I have prophetic gifts and can understand all mysteries and all knowledge, and if I have all faith so I can move mountains, but do not have love, I am nothing. If I give away everything I own, and if I surrender my body as an offering, but do not have love, I gain nothing.
Love is patient. Love is kind. It does not envy. Love does not brag on itself. It is not inflated by disdain. It is not rude. It is not centered on the separate self. It is not easily angered. It keeps no record of evil. It takes no pleasure in injustice, but rejoices with the truth.
Love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. Prophecies will eventually be discarded. Speaking in tongues will stop, and knowledge will ultimately be set aside.
For we know in part, and we prophesy in part. But when we encounter wholeness, the parts will be released. When I was a child, I talked like a child. I understood like a child. I reasoned like a child. But when I became an adult, I let go of childish ways.
At present, we see unclearly, as in a mirror, but then we will see face to face. Right now, I know imperfectly. Then I will know fully, even as I am fully known. And now remain faith, hope, and love, these three. And the greatest of these is love. Today, we'd like to focus on the fourth section of this passage, which is a very short section focusing on what makes love happy and what makes love sad. Here's the passage. Love takes no pleasure in injustice, but rejoices in the truth.
Love takes no pleasure in injustice, but rejoices in the truth. Many English Bibles choose a different translation for the Greek word adikaios. They call it unrighteousness. But Carmen, you translated it as injustice. Could you talk about that choice as a professional translator?
That's such a wonderful question. Thank you for asking it, Brian. It makes my translator's heart smile big because I'm super interested in a word's roots. So in adikia, the means without, that Greek without, and the dikia means justice. And we need that word today so much. And some of the other words that are used are just kind of really old, like iniquity. They were good in their day. And then I also love thinking about how there are these two Greek goddesses with the names Adikia, and is often depicted as ugly, and then Dike, D-I-K-E, who is depicted as beautiful and powerful. And of course, in the mythology, Dike overcomes Adikia. So what I think about when I think about this word, I know it does have all of these meanings and these other translations: wrongdoing, iniquity, lying, deceitfulness, unrighteousness. But I chose injustice because it reminds me, as a friend of mine often says, that God don't like ugly. Injustice is cruelty, and a compassionate, loving heart is focused on not contributing to injustice and on trying to promote and cultivate justice.
Carmen, that strikes me. I'm remembering someone once said to me, he defined justice as the right use of power or a beneficial use of power, and injustice as a harmful use of power. So to say that it takes no pleasure in wrong uses of power. Well, we have a lot to work with that when we look at our world today, because we see power being used in a lot of ugly, harmful ways. But it's so interesting that in the next line, injustice is contrasted not just with justice as we might expect, but with truth. I wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, it seems to me that the truth is love. And so that brings me back to that simple but very hard sometimes to live out aspect of reality, that reality is love. And so as a prayer for me, for this 1 Corinthians 13 passage, it's always, how can I live love so that I am contributing to justice?
Boy, and so now we have this sort of triad of love and justice and truth. You know, it strikes me one of the things that injustice does is it tells a lie about somebody's worth. So when one person is violent toward another person and they use their power to harm that other person, they're in a sense playing into a lie. And that lie is that the violent person has more rights than the nonviolent person, or that the villain, in a certain sense, is more important than the victim. And so there's this violation of what's really, really true about both parties' personhood.
No, I agree. No, because Howard Thurman, this is one of the things I love about, he's so philosophical, and yet what he always comes back to is that we are all God's children. And so everyone is worth everything.
So that fundamental truth, we're all God's children. We're all of equal worth. We all have equal value. This truth is what injustice tramples upon. And so when this truth gets upheld rather than trampled upon, love rejoices. Now the truth is being lived and justice is being lived. Well, we would now like to invite you to listen once more to this very brief but very rich passage. And then we invite you to respond with a request or a desire. It might be a desire to start to see how power is being abused or used in a healing and creative way. So please listen now as Carmen and I read this short passage 2 more times.
Love takes no pleasure in injustice, but rejoices in the truth.
Love takes no pleasure in injustice, but rejoices in the truth.
As you turn now within to this part of the prayer, consider or even ask God to help you see where common lies do exist and even thrive. These could be popular lies or lies told by powerful people and institutions. And then consider where you can find and express the truth instead. How you can stand and rejoice with the truth in your own life.
In the brief silence that follows, we invite you to let this justice and truth be present to you. And we invite you to be present to justice and truth. We invite you to sit in the presence of joy as well, the joy that arises from the right use of power and commitment to the truth. Thanks for investing this time in learning how to see. We trust that each episode will send thousands of us back into our daily lives with a little more skill and a little more depth in seeing everything and everyone everywhere with eyes of love.
Big thanks to Corey Wayne, Dorothy Abrams, and Vanessa Yee, who produced Learning How to See. Thanks to April Stace for her musical support. This episode was edited and mixed by the team at Sound On, Sound Off. To learn more about their work, visit soundonsoundoff.com. Thanks to the Center for Action and Contemplation for making Learning How to See possible. And special thanks to you for your investment of time.
Do you feel called to walk a more contemplative path? The Center for Action and Contemplation is an educational nonprofit supporting the journey of inner transformation. Our programs and resources will help grow your consciousness, deepen your prayer practice, and strengthen your compassionate engagement with the world. Learn more about our resources, such as publications, podcasts, email series, and events at www.cac.org.